our editor's collection is kind of a call to political scientists to give climate change urgent attention, because we still find that not enough attention is given to this very urgent issue. So we would like to know from you what you see the key gaps in our understanding about the politics of climate change, and what are the questions that you think political scientists specifically should be tackling with respect to climate change.
Well, there's an enormous list of things I think need working on, but for normative theorists like me, the first thing I think is to pay attention to the facts, to the empirics, and not just go on about issues of justice that we've been talking about for centuries. I mean, those are also very important and very fundamental, but the specific form that issues of justice are taking now is changing along with events. So, for example, a lot of work has been done on the just distribution of reductions in emissions. That's what I was talking about earlier, when I was talking about the subsistence emissions and luxury emissions. But there's also adaptation now. I mean, we're realizing that unfortunately, we've done so little to reduce emissions that a lot of climate change is already happening. And in many cases, countries are having to adapt to it. So besides the question of what's the just distribution of efforts to reduce emissions, there's the question that what's the just distribution of paying for adaptation. And now there's what the climate people call loss and damage, which is, suppose you can't adapt and things have already gone wrong. I mean, a forest fire has already burned your town, so that's a loss and a severe damage. Who should pay for that? And and one other specific thing is we also now realize that there needs to be a lot of carbon dioxide removal, because we haven't done enough emissions reduction. We're going to have to extract some carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Once again, who should pay? And I'm inclined to think that the answers to all these questions are more or less the same. That is, I'm inclined to think that the nations that have done the most to cause the problem and the nations that have the most capacity should contribute the most on all these issues. But other people think you really need a different principle for each different kind of problem. And so the distribution, maybe, for example, maybe the distribution of the costs for carbon dioxide removal should partly be based on whether you did enough emissions reduction. And if you didn't do enough emissions reduction, maybe you should have to do more carbon dioxide removal to make up for it. Anyway, so, I mean, there's a horde of these normative issues. On more empirical issues, there are all sorts of things. One, I sort of think of, there are problems about inequality, and there are problems about the effectiveness of mass movements. And I actually think of these two together because the only thought I've had so far about what to do about the inequality is to have mass movements. But I think we need to look at both of these. For example, on the inequality, the Stockholm Environment Institute, in cooperation with Oxfam, did a study, and the whole study and all the data are online, but Oxfam did a little report that was called, let's see, I wrote it down here somewhere, Confronting Carbon Inequality. And, you know, they found things like the 10% of the 10% of the population who are the richest emit 52% of the carbon emissions, because richer people engage in lots of optional activities, what I would call luxury emissions. And a lot of these activities are more emissions intensive than some of the more basic ones. Anyway, it turns out that roughly speaking, the richer people are, the more their emissions are. So that's a real problem, I think. I mean, it's certainly an issue about justice. But politically, of course, the question is, what do you do about this? Because these rich people are, for the most part, also the politically most powerful people. I mean, one clear thing you could do about this is have luxury taxes or wealth taxes, or you could have a carbon tax, but where the rate of the tax was higher on buying a yacht than on buying a small hybrid car, say. But to set that up, you need political action. And the problem, obviously, is how do you get the people who would end up paying the most taxes to agree to set things up that way, in a way that's more expensive for them. And I think, this is something political scientists could do a lot of work on. What's currently happening is there are various mass movements, Greta Thunberg and her fossil fuel Fridays, is that what she calls them? Anyway, her special Fridays for climate change, and organizations like Extinction Rebellion and Insulate, who, right now are blocking highways in London. But the question is, is this politically effective, or are these people making more people angry and obstinate, or are they calling attention in an effective way? So political scientists who work on mass movements and other ways of bringing about political change, I think, could make a huge contribution here. Completely other kind of work, comparative politics people, I think, could work on some of the countries that are the biggest obstacles, like my own country, the United States, but also Russia, which, its economy is heavily dependent on exporting gas and oil. And it's hard to think that Russia's going to wholeheartedly pitch in on climate change. Brazil, where you have a president who's actually encouraging people to burn down the Amazon. I mean, by my lights, this is idiotic. But the question is, what do you do? I mean, this guy got elected president by the Brazilian people, and so on. Or Australia does less extreme, but still a problem, is Scott Morrison in Australia. So we need comparative politics people to look at Australia, Russia, U.S., Brazil, and think about, what's going on and what would have to change if we're going to get any general compliance with the Paris Agreement and get it fast enough. I could rattle on here quite a ways. I mean, one other thing that's really important, I think, is that I mentioned already that the Paris Agreement doesn't have any real enforcement mechanisms, but what it does have are these, every 5 years, there's to be a stock take, and there's supposed to be a ratcheting up of the nationally determined commitments. I think a lot of thought could be given to exactly how this is supposed to work, whether it's likely to work, and if it's not likely to work, what else might we do? And an even more general question is, how important are multilateral agreements like the Paris Agreement? Should we be focusing on the Paris Agreement, or should we instead be focusing on domestic politics in, various obstinate countries like Brazil and Russia and so on? but sort of at what, look at national level action, including mass movements, but other things, look at international action, including multilateral treaties, but maybe other things. I mean, maybe, we should impose economic sanctions on countries that don't cooperate, or less extreme, of course, are these border controls that people are talking about, that you would, or tariffs, border charges at the border on products that have been made with very high carbon emissions. And all these things need good, hard looks by political scientists.